Hi, this is Jim of Shiloh Hall, and I'd like to have a discussion, a deliberation concerning the promise of high or the promise of life. So, um, again, I can only speak for myself, but until a few years ago, I just, having been a Christian living in the New Covenant writings, thinking that the Old Covenant writings were for Israel, people that a different people. I just did not give them enough respect and time and effort. And in the last couple of years, that's what we've done. We've gone and visited and spent time in the old writings and in the additional writings, the hidden writings that have been hidden from us, like Enoch and Jubilees and Second Esdras and Second Baruch. Writings that I heavily suggest that if you want to know, to me, the truths have been hidden, and it's a shame because they're out there, and maybe they've been difficult to obtain in the past, but they're not so difficult to obtain now. They're readily available, at least for now. They're readily available. If you want to know what else has been told us, given us by prophets in scriptures, you need to be spending time with Enoch and Jubilees and Second Ezra, Second Baruch, the 12 patriarchs. There's, if you're serious about your faith, if you're serious about Messiah, if you're serious about your Elohim, Yahuwah, whatever you want to do, if you're serious about it, you do not, and you have not spent any time in these extra writings, you do not have the full message. You cannot. It's not possible. There's so much missing information that I think you need. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that in the book of 66, the critical things we could still get to, and some of what I've been sharing in the promise of or the promised land, the gathering, the high, the promise of Messiah. Those are, you can find that in the 66 books. But some of the things that you need to help fill in the gaps, to help you more fully understand from the 66, you find in Enoch, you find in Jubilees. So, but what I'd like to do with this particular video is I'm discussing the promise of high or the promise of life. My wife's been understanding for many years, at least in the Greek scriptures, that there was a differentiation. In our translations, they use the term life, but in the Greek, there were two different kinds of words for life. There was the Zoe life, and then I think it was Zeo life. It doesn't really matter. Two different words. One of them was a God kind of life. One of them was just life like we understand life that a dog might experience, like, well, that we all experience. But there was this God kind of life. In recent, as we have gotten into more of the Hebrew writings, the scriptures that are based upon more Hebrew writings in their translations, who are not replacing all of the Hebrew words with English words, then we're learning that there's a difference. And really, you could kind of tell, even if they continue to just use life in all occurrences, you can tell by context. As you have spent time, you can tell by context when they're talking about life in the earthly life and life in everlasting life, the spiritual life. You can kind of tell. But in our versions, where they're using the term high, Hai, which is the Hebrew English word. It's the English word for the Hebrew word. Uh, but it also differentiates when used correctly, or at least to our understanding, when used correctly, it is referencing that spiritual life, that high, that life everlasting. So really, the point of this particular video, which will probably be short, I hope it's short because I'm going too long on the other videos, but in the old covenant, right, in the old writings, the writings to of the prophets, well, Moses, I guess he was a prophet too, but in the writings to Israel, in the writings, Enoch's writings, there was an understanding that there was a difference between this life, this earthly life, and the life eternal, life everlasting. And when we are reading, for instance, when we're reading Moses in the Torah, when we're talking about death, well, clearly, when you do something worthy of death that Yahuwah thinks is deems it worthy of death, well, if you practice such things, if you do one-off guilty, no, that is not Yahuwah's way. He's not going to just sit and hit you with a hammer because you failed to do perfect. He's not expecting perfect. He understands our flesh better than we understand our flesh. But if we have the mind and the thought, and if we just don't care and we have the practice of lawlessness, we have the practice of not keeping Torah, not keeping his ways, not keeping his witnesses, basically we don't really care about Yahweh and what he's commanded us and how he's taught us to live. If we don't care, then we're going to die. So when he says that, though, does everybody who fails to keep Torah die immediately? No, they don't. One of the examples in when you're reading Torah is there's an example of a man picking up sticks, and he's doing it on the Sabbath, which is, the Torah reads that a man, if you're going to work and you're going to do these things on the Sabbath, it's worthy of death. This is how serious Yahweh takes the Sabbath. Well, in this example, there's a man who's picking up sticks and then is killed. In our translations anyway, he's killed. Actually, it's if I remember correctly, it's brought to Moses' attention that he's picking up sticks. And what do we do? Because the Torah says a man who's working on the Sabbath is worthy of death. So Moses asks Yahweh, and Yahweh says, yes, he's worthy of death. Take him outside the camp and take care of him, stone him. I believe that's what they did. So they did. In this particular case, this man, for picking up sticks, is taken outside the camp and stoned to death. And that seems, especially the way we've been conditioned and trained in the church by the teachings of the church, to go, see, this is why we reject these laws and why they're thrown out, because they're just too harsh and nobody can live them. But that's really, I'm convinced, having spent a lot of time now in the old writings, that a couple of nuances with regard to that story would be of importance. First of all, I think picking up sticks probably was not just the idea that he was just walking around picking up sticks. No, he probably had a livelihood involving sticks, because one of the commands is that we're not to be doing livelihood things. Clearly, it's not a command to do no work, because the Levites are commanded to work. There is some preparatory work no matter what. If you're going to eat, there's some prep work you got to do. We are trying to walk in the Sabbath, and my wife's trying not to work, but you can't. You cannot not work and still also meet on the Sabbath and have dinner. Yeah, you prepare it the day before if you can, so that you're not doing much preparation. You're not slaving over a stove, but you cannot not work. But what we are called to not do is not do our regular work. Now, forgive me, all of you who, because our society draws us into this, for all of you in the food services industries, in the retail industries, in the medical healthcare industries, that you're required, because um, our culture is making people work on the day that, if we had a culture that was Yahweh based, Torah based, this would be a non-issue, because everybody would be not working on Sabbath on the seventh day. But it is an issue for everybody today, and some of us, like my wife and I and my family, we can take Sabbath, because of the type of work we do. So it's not that hard it's hard, because it was hard. It was hard to train ourselves to do it. Now it's wonderful. But it was hard backing ourselves away. That was the day I wanted to do all my yard work and do all the things around the house I got to get done. And then we would go to church on the first day. And so that was the day that, well, now we've trained ourselves. We are taking the seventh day, the Sabbath day, as our day to spend time with Yahuwah. We're not going to a church on the first of the week, which first day of the week, which I can't imagine. I haven't seen that it's a sin to go on to church on the first day of the week, but I've got to have that day to get my stuff done around the house. So we've moved our day of spending time with Yahuwah and Elohim to the Sabbath day, as I believe is what we're called to do, because he calls a congregation and a feast, a time together. He calls us together on that Sabbath. And I'm pretty confident that's when Paul says, do not forsake, getting together. He's not talking about just a weekly gathering for the sake of it. No, he's do not forsake gathering on the Sabbath, because that's the command. But let me just also say as quickly as I can, because I don't, in saying that, I know it's hard for people who cannot do it. And I'm pretty confident if I can give you room, Yahweh understands better than I can. And so he'll know your heart as to what I would say, that generally speaking, as you are coming into the understanding that Yahweh takes the Sabbath very seriously, then as you can work your way out of a Sabbath day work and into a Sabbath day rest, you will start working towards it. You'll start trying to play your plan if you can, as much as you can. You adhere to that command, because if you're a man of Elohim, if you're a believer, a man of faith, you want to walk in obedience, and you just have to walk it out, walk towards it. And that'd be one of the things you'd be working on. But that's not to say that you're going to get hammered because you are picking up sticks. If that's your livelihood. My thought is, going back to the story of the man picking up sticks, it was probably his livelihood, but there was probably also an attitude of his heart where he just simply didn't care about the command. He doesn't care. And it probably wasn't his first time. It probably wasn't his second time. He probably had a practice of simply not caring about the command. And if you don't care about the command, that means you don't care about the person who gave the command. And the person who gave the command is Moses. But Moses is the mouthpiece of Yahweh. The commands are Yahweh's commands given through Moses. But if you care about Yahweh, you care about his commands, and you do not take it lightly. And if your livelihood is picking up sticks and you don't really care, you're just doing it because you just want to make some money or whatever, that's probably what was going on. But that's not the topic of this particular video. The topic of this video is whether or not Sabbath breaking is considered worthy of death. Well, he happened to die in the moment. So his earthly life, because of his situation, he was cut off. He was cut off. His earthly life was cut off. But for most people, throughout the history, there has been Yahweh has operated in long suffering. He has operated in patience. And he teaches over and over again in his writings that a man who has had this habit of sinning but then gets serious about it, he'll be forgiven all that problem sinning if he starts turning his way toward Yahuwah and towards obedience. Conversely, a man who had this whole history of being obedient, if he starts getting slothful and starts beginning to move towards disobedience, well, the latter state is the one you're going to be credited with. So, the guy who is doing well and then finishes poorly he's going to be judged poorly. He's going to be judged unrighteous. The man who starts poorly but then ends up dealing with righteousness is going to be judged righteous. Is so much of Messiah's teaching is about that. The first shall be last. The guy who didn't work and comes in the last of the day ends up showing up to finish that. I mean, just you got people where they come in and they would agree to work for a certain amount for the day, and then later, as the day progresses, he keeps hiring people, and at the end of the day, he hires a guy who barely even works, and then he starts paying them from the last guy into the first, and he pays the first guy a certain amount. So the guys from the first are going, "Oh man, if he's paying him that much, even though that's the same amount that I agreed to work for, surely when it gets to me, I'm going to get a whole lot more." Well, that's not how it played out. The guy who came in last and barely worked got the same pay that the guy who came in first and worked all day agreed to pay work for. Well, that's the concept that we're talking about. It's the long suffering and the patience. It's this man who starts out doing poorly but finishes. Manasseh, the king, the sovereign, was an example of this. I'm not sure he made it all the way to righteousness. I think he did. I need to read and spend some more time in that. But here's a terrible man, the worst king of all kings in Judah's history, led the people astray. But right at the end, he has his experience with Yahweh and begins to change and begins to try to undo, but then runs out of time, if I remember right. I don't want to butcher that. But here's an example of a man who works all this time, disobedience and not good, and right at the end gets serious and begins to, gets his reward accordingly. Okay, so the purpose of explaining all of this is that, or giving you all this, is that when we're talking about life and high, when a man is breaking Torah and even walking in the breaking of Torah, we are not observing them dying immediately. I don't have to tell you. Everybody can witness all around you and see stories of people who are not dying who deserve to die. Their earthly life is not cut off. And that's hard to understand. And if you are reading the old writings from the standpoint that everything is about this earthly life, then it makes no sense. Uh, you go back to this idea that if you live by for instance, when we're talking about the Torah, the man who practices them will live by them. The man who practices Torah will live by them. Well, does that mean you're going to live because you? I mean, this really kind of comes back to this whole idea of being justified by keeping the law, which you cannot do. I mean, it's a clear teaching of Paul, and it's just a clear teaching. Um, but if you are after Yahuwah, you will keep the Torah because those are his instructions and those are his ways and those are his commands, those are his witnesses. And so you just will keep the Torah. And because you are, you will live by them. I don't mean live in this flesh. You won't live another 30 years. You won't live up to be a ripe old age of 80, or in the days of Moses 130, in the days of whomever, in the days of Enoch 700, 800 years old. That's not the point, because that's not what they mean by high. Those who practice them will live by them. This is not live in the earthly flesh for an extended period of time. That is not the life they're talking about. They're talking about high life everlasting. So those who live by Torah, those who practice Torah will live by them. They will receive high by them. Now, they're not getting high because of keeping the Torah. They're getting high because Yahuwah has made the way. He kept that Torah perfectly to earn and satisfy all the justice requirements. But the high that we get is because of Messiah's work, and then our belief in him and our belief and faith in him is pointing us back to Torah. Our belief and faith in him is obedience to Yahuwah and Messiah in their commands, in their ways, in their witnesses, etc. So the two are intertwined, and it always was. It's not just a new covenant. It's not just a New Testament understanding that we believe on Messiah, so we get the benefit of his eternal life. No, in Israel's days, they who believed on Yahuwah, which is the same thing as believing on Yahushua, the Messiah, believed in him as their Messiah, as their Elohim, believed on him. They did Torah because they were the obedient ones. In all of Israel, you had people who didn't care and weren't obedient, and you had people who did care, the remnant of Israel. As you read the old writings, you're going to be reading the remnant all the time, because it's the remnant who cared. It's the remnant who seek and pursue Yahuwah. And those are the ones that live by Torah because that's the instruction. They do it not because they have to get high. They do it because Yahuwah says do it. And then because they believe, like Abraham did, because they believe, they then get high, not because they're living so righteously that they've earned high, but because they've now received the gift of high through the work of Messiah. So it's all intertwined. Those who practice Torah will high by them. You will have life everlasting through them. So high, life everlasting is not a New Testament, New Covenant thing. It's a from the beginning thing. It is certainly an Old Covenant thing, where if you will, and really it always boils down to, if you are really anxious and you are seeking the Father, seeking Yahuwah, you're seeking Elohim, then you are doing rightly. You are doing righteousness, and you are seeking righteousness. Those things are all hand in hand. That's why we can say that belief and faith is obedience, etc. Because it's all, you cannot say you're in belief and faith and not care what the instructions of Yahuwah are. It just can't exist. I mean, that's a clear teaching in both the Old and New Covenant. Right? It doesn't really matter where you're reading it. You can't do that. If you love Elohim, you will love his ways. And if you love his ways, you will learn his ways and you will do his ways. It's always been. And those who do, those who love him, he will. You're in the palm of his hand and no one takes you out. He will finish that good work he has started in you. You are the chosen, you are the elect. If you, so long as you care and you really seek him, he will assure that you reach high. He will assure that you get there. Your job is to love him. Your job is to pursue him. Your job is to do as you're commanded to do. Conversely, then you've got the man who doesn't care, doesn't die in the moment necessarily, but there's a second death that is coming. It is appointed for all men to die once. All men. The exception might be, those who are living and raptured in the moment that Messiah comes back. But short of that, it's appointed for all men to die once. And what is that death? It's the death of our fleshy body. Our spirit then goes into Sheol, both the righteous and the unrighteous. So those of us who are going to be considered chosen and elect, when we die, our flesh is done. We're done with that struggle. We're done. Our spirit goes to the chamber in Sheol reserved for those who are righteous. In our Lazarus and the rich ruler, where Lazarus goes and sits in the bosom of Abraham, they're in the chamber where they're having deep rest, and it's good down there while they're waiting. It's not as good as what's coming, but it's good down there. And the rich ruler who was disobedient in this life and did not receive judgment in this life is receiving his judgment. And he's in his chamber down there where it's terrible. He's just experiencing terrible things down there because he's in a different chamber of Sheol down there, waiting his time. Because that man, if he's judged unrighteous, he has died once in the flesh, the earth he has died. But his spirit is sitting in Sheol, and that spirit will be raised as well. It will not be raised at the first resurrection when the righteous are raised. When Daniel, I'm looking at Daniel's book over here, when Daniel's raised and Abraham's raised and Lazarus is raised and all these people are raised, not so for the unrighteous. They remain in Sheol for that 1,000 years. But the rest of us are going to be raised. All the dead, all those who are living in the time, are going to be raised and begin receiving high at that point in time. Now, the rest of the unrighteous are sitting in Sheol, and those who are doing unrighteousness now that have not yet died, those who will be born in the millennial period that remain of the flesh, because we will have both spirit and flesh living in the millennial reign. Those who are doing unrighteousness there and die or are alive at the end of that millennial reign, doesn't really matter. At the end of that millennial reign is the great white throne judgment. Everybody knows the great white throne judgment. And the sheep are going to be called on the right hand. And I think that for us, we're not part of this second resurrection. All of us got raised in the first resurrection. We're not part of that second resurrection. All the unrighteous sitting down in Sheol, like the rich and ruler, will be part of that second resurrection. And everybody who's living in the millennial period will be part of that second resurrection. And when that time comes, those who are living in the millennial reign of the flesh, who are raised, whether they've died in the millennial reign or alive at the time, everybody is raised and come to the second throne, the second, uh, the second resurrection, which is the great white throne judgment. And the sheep will be put on the right hand, all those written in the Lamb's book of life, and the goats on the left. Those who are written in the Lamb's book of life will become part of our group. They will be living in high. They receive high. They're going to receive their reward, which is high. Those who are the goats are going to be judged along with all of those who are now raised out of Sheol and are standing there on his left side. They're all going to be judged and thrown into the lake of fire, and that is the second death. So when we're talking about death, I assure you, if you are if you're going to be counted among the unrighteous and you're going to live unrighteously, you may not pay for it in this life. But when you die, you will go to Sheol, where it will be uncomfortable. And then at the end of all things, when the last enemy is put that is put to that is put down as death, you will be raised at that point in time, and you will be raised, and then you will be subject to the second death. You will die. So that's why you can say in the old writings, and they understood this. They understood this more than people. I mean, they don't have a perfect understanding, because none of us have had a perfect understanding, but they've understood it more than our church, our New Testament, our current culture and grouping of people understood that they understood it. They understood high for good living and death for bad living. If you keep the commands, you receive high, because it represents your relationship to Yahweh. If you don't keep the commands, it represents your relationship to Yahweh, and you don't know and you don't care, and you die. So when Messiah says, or when Yahweh says, those who do not keep Torah will die. Certain, not every act of breaking Torah is worthy of death, but there are lots of actions. Sabbath breaking is one of them, that if you don't keep it, you will die. You will die. If you don't care enough and you are counted in the unrighteous, among the unrighteous, you will not only experience the first death that everyone's appointed to, you will experience the second death. And if you don't die early in the first death, you will assuredly die in the second death. That's why it's kind of important that you value Yahuwah Elohim, and you value keeping his ways, his commands, and you do it, because if you do not, you will be judged. And it's clear in Second Esdras and Second Baruch, when you get into these writings, that the vast majority of people will be judged unrighteous. By far, it's the remnant that cares and seeks Yahuwah. All right. So I think that is enough. So the promise of high is the promise of everlasting life. The promise of everlasting life that comes through the work of Messiah. But we are keeping, because we value the Torah, we keep his commands, we keep his ways, all the things that Messiah shares with us to do, and all of his apostles share with us to do. We need to be keeping his ways and keeping his Torah, because that's what we do when we love him. And if we're not doing it, it's kind of evidence that you don't love him. If you love him, you will do it. If you're not doing it, you're evidencing that you don't love him. And if you don't love him, you don't get high. You just don't get high. So that sounds funny, but you get the idea. High as in HAI. So the promise of high, the promise of everlasting life, is the promise that's going to be realized. While we've gotten it because Messiah has earned it, we don't realize it, not in its fullest form, until Messiah comes back in the second coming, and we are resurrected into our spiritual body, and then we really live out high. Now, we're already living high. Even if we die, we are still living high, because we are now, our spirit's down in Sheol, but it's still not the full high. The full high occurs when Messiah comes at his second coming. All right. Thanks. Maybe Barak.